Exodus chapter 20, verse 22 to 26. And the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness may not be exposed on it." It is intriguing that the giving of the 10 commandments is followed by instructions regarding the altar. The 10 commandments are a representation of God's holiness, that is, who He is. They are a display of God's glory. But now, God points to the altar. He reminds Israel of His own being, one who is in heaven above all other beings and things, and one who is invisible. He forbids them to think of Him in any other concrete terms. Even the most precious things of earth, gold and silver, are not to be compared with Him. It is an insult and a profanation of His divine majesty and greatness to think of Him in the same breath as an object made of silver and gold. But if you want to remember Him, He wanted them to remember Him this way. An altar. This is a place built for only one purpose: to offer something to God by fire. It is a place where things are devoted to God, set apart utterly for His use, by means of fire which consumes and thus forbids their ever being used in any other way. The first altar in the Bible is recorded in Genesis chapter 8 verse 20, where Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of the very clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. It was an act of worship and of thankful acknowledgement that God had given him and the human race a new lease of life through the ark. He offered clean sacrifices, thus accepting God's standard as his own. For the line between clean and unclean is one which is drawn by God and not something which is natural to us. Thus Noah put aside his own human intelligence in accepting the instructions of God as to his daily life. Instructions which would determine what he could offer to God. Instructions which required faith and obedience. The spirit of trustful and obedient gratitude and respect was a sweet-smelling aroma that moved God's heart to pleasure, and which God brought forth the great promise that the world would never again be destroyed by water. Before God gave His law through Moses, men made altars wherever they were out of whatever material was available. We see the examples of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Gideon, building altars and worshiping God. An altar represents a person's desire to offer something completely to the Lord as a token of his own gratitude and worshipful response to the revelation of God. In his instruction to Moses, God asked him to make an altar of earth. Earth represents the humble material from which all humanity was formed. Such an altar would not be permanent. The greatness of the altar was not in its own durability or beauty, but in the fact that it had been used to devote something to God, to offer something to God once upon a time. God goes on to say that if a stone altar is built, the stones must be just as they were taken from the ground. Man's tool is not to come upon a single stone on the altar. With God, human skill or ornamentation on the altar is a profanation. It defiles the holiness of the altar. The lesson repeated here is the same that the Lord spoke to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23, verse 16 to 19. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes it sacred? It is not the costliness or the value of the altar that is important. In fact, it is not even the altar that is important. It is the fact that the gift was devoted to God upon the altar that gives the altar all its significance. That sacrifice was done in the presence of God. And therefore, that offering which the person brought was given to in the presence of God. The scribes and the Pharisees had all of these things. The outward appearances, the skill, the beautification, the refinement, or the things that are highly esteemed among men are an abomination in the sight of God. The poor widow offered something that outweighed all the great offerings made that day. The lesson is so clear. It is the love and faith and reverence of a humble and grateful heart that makes the worship acceptable and valuable to God. Nothing else can draw us near to God except a broken and a contrite heart that knows how to value the goodness and the gracious loving kindness of God. Such a heart will offer the sacrifices of peace with God and with his people. We see the example in the altar built by Elijah on Mount Carmel. On that day, Israel had openly turned to paganism under the influence of Jezebel. We see the first thing that Elijah did in his contest with the prophets of Baal was to build up that altar. We must remember that at that time, they were living in the divided kingdom. Despite that fact, he took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. 1 Kings chapter 18, 31 and 32. It was on this rebuilt altar, symbolizing the offering that was made in the name of the united people of God, that God rained down fire and put the Baal worshippers to shame. The insignificance of the altar makes the place of worship a total non-issue. What is important is how we worship. In the conversation with the Samaritan woman, the question was not whether you worship God in this mountain or in that mountain. Jesus said, God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. How plain it is that it is not the altar but the gift that is important when dealing with the all-seeing and all-knowing God. If we don't remember that we bring this offering from the depth of our heart, in spirit and in truth, then that offering is not acceptable to God. He desires and requires truth in our inner parts. A heart of worship is fundamental to true worship. If the heart is not devoted to God, there is no meaning in the sacrifice of praise. But for the person who comes to God with a broken and a sincere heart of repentance and faith, there is blessing. Repentance acknowledges that God is right and I am wrong, and that therefore I need to and I am ready to turn away from my own wicked ways and turn to Him to trust Him and obey Him, trusting Him to be all that I need. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 to 24, the Lord gives a prime example of this. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. If we do not honor God enough to obey Him and be at peace with our fellow worshipper, we have no place at this altar. For our sacrifice is merely outward, merely a lie. Let us come to God as we are, frail earthen vessels that are presented to Him as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. God bless.